here on the Rants of Izzo on Spreely Media. 3 minutes till we're live. If you're watching on one of those inferior platforms like YouTube, Rumble, all that other stuff, you only get the first few minutes. And then you have to go to Spreely.com, rantsofizzo.com. When you go to Spreely.com, don't forget, if you're tired of all the free speech, censored bullshit, you go to Spreely.com. There is a social media platform there. It's very much like Facebook. You can say whatever you want, and if you're offended, you can actually email and get a response from the CEO. It's kind of nice. When you're on Spreely.com, what you can do is you can check out the other shows that are on there, right? The Burn Pit Podcast, Report and Opine, The Dumb Show, Don't Unfriend Me Show, Wake Up America with Austin Peters, one of the greatest, Peterson, one of the greatest libertarian minds of our time, and much more. All right, 2 minutes, we're live. Don't forget to chat on rantsofizzo.com as well. Bev, good to see you in the chat. All right, kids, 1 minute. Enjoy the show. Make sure you share it. We're on Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, iTunes, all the podcasts as well, too.
Sit down, shut up, and pay attention.
Damn!
This is the Rants of Izzo Show with your hosts, Dominick Izzo, from porn to politics. We touch every third rail we can find. You might want to put your headphones on so your mom can't hear this. It's been called the most entertaining 60 minutes on the internet, and it starts now. Let's do this.
All right, it's Tuesday here, Rants of Izzo, rantsofizzo.com, and Spreely Media. Hope you guys are doing well and enjoying the day. Actually got a breakout here in Chicago. It's 70-something degrees, so I will be having my afternoon cigar outside instead of polluting my office. That's what real men do, is we have cigars in the middle of the afternoon, especially after lunch. All right, it's Tuesday. I had a new special guest here for Tuesday, and the reason being is, if you had seen Scott Sieverts and I talking a couple of weeks ago on Wednesday, we're Scott from the Burn Pit Podcast, who, you know, he's a Marine, I'm ex-cop, and we were talking about this culture of, how do I say this, delusional men in one end of the spectrum, where either men are just weak as hell, as we've seen over the last several years with the hashtag toxic masculinity, the Me Too movement, or men who they're gurus, self-appointed gurus of making men and all this stuff. So after the show, Scott and I did rip into a couple people that we saw online, but I'm like, all right, I have to get an opposing opinion. And I was looking online, and I came across my guest who's with me today, Mr. Rafa Kandi from manofwar.us. And I had seen his content before, and I liked it. And I'm a little bit biased. Law enforcement background, DEA background, so federal. What I did pay attention to was his content, the reels on social media, and I liked his delivery. He wasn't screaming with his shirts off, look at me, and dropping F-bombs every other word. He had proper, a good connection for men as far as I'm concerned. And I went, all right, I'm going to take the scratching the surface of what I've seen, invite him on the show, and to have a conversation with him, because I think we need clarification for what he does and why it's needed. So, Rafa, man, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time out to join me today, and looking forward to hearing about everything that you do.
Hey, man, it's an honor to be on your show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, not a problem at all. We have to get out of the way first, the 30,000 foot view of who Rafa Kandi is, because I can go into your bio, DEA, law enforcement. I know what that means to me, and I know what that means to the marketing audience, right? If you're going to, I leverage my law enforcement all the time when I teach Wing Chun. Like, I teach a martial art, and if I ever sat there and I'm going to compete with you, and you're not a cop or anybody else, and we've all got the schools in the same town, I'm going to go, yeah, well, I'm a cop. So it's marketing purposes. But for the layman or anybody else or the average listener, who is Rafa Kandi at his core? That's who I want to know, because we have to talk about how that was the seed planted for Man of War.
All right, so let me kind of dig deep a little bit right off the bat. Man of War started about a little bit over 7.5 years ago. I was an instructor in the police academy for over a decade. And what I started to see was the unfortunate demise of that warrior mentality. We started to see literally these young men that were coming in, these young candidates, the recruits, softer and softer and softer. And I was a DT instructor. I was a firearms instructor. And, our goal was to give them the mindset, right, to survive in the streets. But we just started to see these young men coming in weaker and weaker. So I got to the point where I said, you know what, I got to say something. I got to start talking about this. So I started the Man of War podcast that took off, and it was just more about really redefining the warrior aspect, the warrior mentality in every man. And what we started to see was there was a lot of younger men and even older men actually start gravitate to that warrior aspect, living by a code, being a man of honor, of integrity, a man who has resiliency, who has drive, of course, who has purpose, and above all, that serves for something higher than himself, a higher purpose. So going back to my core, to answer your question here, as a police academy instructor, I started to see that, and I started to build this movement of men. And I just retired a year and 7 months ago. I hung my badge, and because this became my purpose, my mission, my core, to lead men, to really lead this movement of warrior men. It's not just masculine men. A lot of guys out there are talking masculinity. They're talking just being great men. We're talking about bringing back that edge, the warrior culture of old, into the men in our world now. So that has been my driving force. That has been what helps me wake up every morning with this passion, with this energy in my gut. And, what can I tell you? I believe truly that I'm doing God's work at the end of the day here. I'm authentic. I'm straightforward. I am myself a work in progress, like every man here that goes through this program. But at the end, it's serving for something higher than me. And I believe truly that, like I said a minute ago, that I am doing God's work.
There is so much you said that I feel when you're talking about it. I left in 2019 in law enforcement, and there's so many questions I could ask you, because I want the raw side of it. We saw the candidates start to come in after 2010. The people who could not fight their way out of a wet paper bag, the people who didn't take the training seriously, the people who were like, well, what do you mean the warrior mindset? It's just, which part of you aren't you understanding that, you're going to see the worst part of human beings, and your job is sadly, to take away someone's life or freedom on a daily basis lawfully. Cops were some of the worst people we ever taught when it came down to defensive tactics. That was my field of expertise, because you'd go to a class, and this is, I want to parallel this. I want to come back to this later on with your program. And cops always came to class to show you what they know, never what they're not a very open-minded group of people.
Sure.
When you're in this academy teaching, and you've seen, I mean, if you are just hanging up the badge now, you've gone through the disheartening aspect of, this is what they're sending out on our streets. How did you find the fuel and drive? Because I think we both know you're going to touch a few and you're going to impact a few, but the majority of them are not what the citizen deserves to have them upholding their oath for. How did you find that passion to continue all the way up until just very recently?
Yeah, well, it took, let me kind of backtrack a little bit. When I first came through the academy, you know, we had drill sergeants. It was a very hardcore type of mentality that they were, pushing on us. There was more about, the drive, the awareness, that situational awareness, the sense of honor. However, over the last 10 years, a good decade, we saw that spiral in a downward manner. And we saw the police academy get softer across all fronts. So I started to disagree with the higher ups in the police academy. Some of the programs that we had in place, I felt were just absolutely trash. And you made a great point. These young men take an oath, but the reality is that, can they truly protect and serve? And that was one of the questions that I brought up. I said, look, these young men are not ready. They're not ready yet. What we're teaching them here holds really very little weight on the street, from a firearms perspective, from a defensive tactics perspective, and just their passing grades. Their scores were considerably lower than what I came through. So I hung on because I believed that at some point, one of the directors in this police academy would have a change of heart and say, we could no longer put out this kind of officer in the street. And the more research I did, I traveled not just in the United States, but I want to say I traveled all over South America. I taught different SWAT teams. I taught all sorts of, even into the military. A lot of it was teaching.